Hey guys! Sheaf of Rice Kite. Welcome back to Sleeping Stone Whispers. Tonight's story, An Afternoon of Kite Flying in Open Fields, is a slow and peaceful journey into a quiet countryside afternoon, where the wind moves gently, the grass sways lazily, and time feels like it has decided to rest. It's a story about simple moments, soft sunlight, and the calming rhythm of a kite rising and falling in the open sky. If you're someone who loves slow, cozy storytelling that helps your mind unwind after a long day, this one is for you. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let this gentle afternoon carry you toward peaceful rest. And if you enjoy relaxing stories like this, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Sleeping Stone Whispers so you never miss another quiet tale to fall asleep to. The afternoon began in the slowest possible way. Lunch had ended not with a sound, but with a feeling. The kind that settles softly into a room like warm dust drifting through sunlight. Plates had been cleared without hurry. The last sip of water had been taken without thought. Even the ceiling fan above seemed to turn more lazily than usual, as if it too had eaten well and found itself heavy with contentment. Outside, the open fields waited. But no one rushed toward them. The house stood still in the drowsy glow of early afternoon. Curtains shifted gently in the faint breeze that slipped in through half-open windows. Somewhere far away, a crow called once, not urgently, not loudly, just once, as if reminding the world that it was still there. On the wooden table near the doorway lay a kite. It had been placed there earlier in the day, its thin paper surface smooth and uncreased, its colors calm rather than bright. The string was wound carefully around a simple spool. Nothing about it demanded attention. It simply waited. And waiting felt right. After lunch, footsteps slowed naturally. Shoes were slipped on without bending fully, almost absent-mindedly. A glass of water was taken for the walk, though no one was truly thirsty. The sun outside was warm but not sharp, casting a pale golden wash over the yard. The gate creaked in a familiar, unbothered way as it opened. Beyond it, the path stretched toward the wide open fields, fields that seemed larger in the afternoon quiet than they ever did in the morning. The grass bent slightly under a breeze that wasn't strong enough to be useful, but strong enough to remind you it existed. There was no conversation at first. Only the soft sound of footsteps on dry soil. The earth felt warm through thin soles. Pebbles shifted lazily. A dragonfly hovered nearby, its wings shimmering for a moment before it drifted off, unconcerned. The kite was carried loosely at one side. It didn't flutter. It didn't strain. The air wasn't ready yet. Reaching the field felt less like arriving somewhere and more like stepping into a pause. The land stretched outward in gentle waves of green and faded yellow. No tall buildings. No passing vehicles. Just distance. A small patch of flattened grass suggested where someone might sit. And so, slowly, that's what happened. The spool of string was set down first. Then the kite. Then a quiet sigh, not from tiredness exactly, but from the simple relief of not needing to move quickly anymore. The sky above was wide and pale blue, brushed with thin, lazy clouds that seemed undecided about where they were going. They drifted without urgency, like thoughts that hadn't fully formed. There was a moment, a long one, where nothing at all was done. Just sitting. Listening. The sound of grass rubbing against itself. The distant murmur of something unseen, perhaps a farmer in another field, perhaps the wind moving through trees too far away to notice clearly. The kite lay on the ground, its paper surface catching sunlight in small flashes. It looked light enough to rise with the smallest encouragement, but the air refused to cooperate just yet. That was fine. There was no schedule. Fingers picked up the spool and turned it idly once or twice, unwinding a few inches of string and then winding it back again. The motion felt repetitive in the best possible way, simple, circular, calming. A breeze arrived. Then left. The kite shifted slightly, then rested again. No disappointment followed. Only observation. The afternoon seemed to stretch wider with every passing minute, as though time itself had decided to lie down in the grass and rest alongside everything else. Eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the field met the sky in a soft blur. Heat shimmered faintly above the earth, bending the view just enough to make everything look slightly dreamy. Another breeze came, brushing gently against cheeks, lifting a corner of the kite for half a second. Almost. But not yet. And so there was more waiting. More listening. More of that quiet after lunch, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand silence but simply encourages it. Somewhere far off, a cowbell chimed once. Then again. Slow. Unhurried. The kite would fly eventually. But for now, the afternoon itself was enough. The field breathed. The sky drifted. And everything, including the small figure sitting beside an unlaunched kite, seemed perfectly content to do nothing at all. The decision to walk toward the fields did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly. There was no sudden burst of excitement, no dramatic announcement. Just a small shift in posture, a gentle brushing of hands against knees, and a slow glance toward the open land beyond the yard. The afternoon had settled fully now, spreading its warmth across rooftops and resting calmly on fences and tree branches. The kite was picked up again. Its paper surface felt slightly warmer than before, having rested in sunlight. The wooden frame inside was light, almost delicate. The spool of string hung loosely from 2 fingers, tapping softly against the side of a leg with each step. The path toward the fields was narrow and familiar. Dry soil pressed flat by many quiet journeys stretched ahead, edged by small tufts of grass and wildflowers that had grown without permission. Some flowers were barely open, their petals slow and unbothered by time. Others leaned gently, bowing under their own small weight. The walk began without hurry. Each step felt measured, almost thoughtful. The air was thick with that post-lunch calm, not heavy, but slow. It wrapped around everything like a soft blanket, making even simple movements feel deliberate. A dog barked once in the distance, then stopped, as if realizing it had nothing important to say. Somewhere closer, the faint rustle of leaves suggested a squirrel or perhaps just the wind brushing through branches. The sun sat comfortably above, no longer climbing, not yet descending. Its light wasn't sharp or blinding. Instead, it coated the world in a gentle gold that softened edges and blurred sharp lines. The kite shifted slightly with the breeze. Not enough to lift. Just enough to remind anyone holding it that it wanted to try. Shoes scuffed lightly against small stones. A patch of uneven ground required a slower step, a moment of balance. The spool rolled slightly in hand, the string catching the light for a brief shimmer before disappearing again against the earth tones around it. The fields ahead looked wider than they had from the house. As the distance closed, the openness grew. The fences that once seemed far now felt like small lines drawn gently across a very large canvas. Beyond them, tall grass swayed lazily, bending and rising in slow rhythm. The air smelled faintly of dry earth and distant hay. It was a familiar scent, the kind that doesn't demand attention but feels reassuring nonetheless. Halfway along the path, the walking slowed even further. There was no reason to rush the moment. The afternoon wasn't going anywhere. The fields would remain exactly where they were, patient and waiting. Even the breeze seemed to understand this, arriving softly and leaving without insistence. A single butterfly crossed the path. It fluttered erratically, undecided in its direction, then disappeared into taller grass. The kite's paper flickered once as the wind brushed it from behind, but the movement faded quickly. Steps continued. The sound of distant cows became clearer now, low, unhurried calls that blended into the background like a steady hum. The occasional metallic clink of a bell drifted through the air, slow and spaced apart. Reaching the edge of the fields felt less like arriving somewhere new and more like returning to something that had always been there. The ground opened up. The grass stretched outward without interruption. The sky seemed larger here, uninterrupted by rooftops or wires. It felt possible to walk in any direction and never quite reach the end. The path gradually faded into softer soil, less defined and more forgiving beneath each step. The kite was lifted slightly higher, almost instinctively, as if preparing for something. The spool was adjusted in hand. A thumb traced the edge of the wooden frame, feeling the smoothness of its simple design. Still, no rush. The afternoon remained steady and calm. A breeze moved across the field in a visible wave, pressing grass down in one direction before letting it rise again. It was almost enough. Almost. But for now, the walk itself was enough. The slow rhythm of footsteps. The quiet companionship of wind. The steady presence of open sky above. There was comfort in moving without urgency, in letting the journey stretch out, unmeasured and unhurried. And so the walk continued a few steps further into the wide, waiting field, where the kite might finally begin to lift, but only when the afternoon felt ready. Standing in the middle of the open field felt different from walking toward it. There were no more steps to take for now. No path guiding the direction forward. Just grass stretching outward and the wide sky above, calm and patient. The afternoon had grown quieter still, as if even the smallest sounds had decided to rest. The kite remained in hand. It was light, so light that it almost seemed like it shouldn't have weighed at all. And yet, standing there, its presence felt noticeable. The thin wooden frame pressed gently against fingers. The paper, smooth and slightly warm from the sun, trembled faintly whenever the breeze brushed by. It was not a heavy object. But it carried something more than wood and paper. The spool of string hung from the other hand, round and simple. Its wooden edges were smooth from use. A faint scent of dry fiber rose from the tightly wound thread. When the spool shifted, the string whispered softly against itself, a barely there sound, like quiet breathing. The fingers adjusted their grip. The thumb traced the crossing point where the wooden sticks met at the center of the kite. The knot was small and neat, tied carefully long ago. It held everything together. Without it, the shape would collapse. The breeze stirred again. The kite's tail lifted slightly off the ground, then fell back down. Its paper surface rippled once, a small shiver, before settling again into stillness. It was strange how something so delicate could feel so steady. Holding the kite upright, the frame pressed gently against the palm. The edges cast thin shadows across the paper. The sunlight passed through the material in certain spots, making it glow faintly from within. There was no hurry to release it. Instead, there was a quiet awareness of the weight, not heavy in the usual sense, but present. The kind of weight that asks for patience. The kind that waits for the right moment. The field around remained undisturbed. Grass bent in slow waves. A faint hum of insects drifted near the ears, steady and rhythmic. Far off, a bird called once and then went silent, as though reconsidering the effort. The kite leaned slightly into the breeze again. This time it tugged, only gently, against the hand holding it. Not enough to lift. Just enough to be noticed. The fingers tightened instinctively, careful not to crease the paper. The spool shifted in the other hand, rolling slightly against the palm. A small length of string loosened, then stopped. The wind faded. And with it, the small tug disappeared. There was something peaceful about this quiet negotiation between hand and air. A silent conversation happening without words. The kite wanting to rise. The afternoon deciding whether it was ready. The arms relaxed. The kite lowered slightly, its bottom edge brushing against the tops of grass blades. A few strands caught briefly against the paper before sliding free. The spool was examined for a moment. Its circular shape was simple and honest. No decoration. No color. Just smooth wood and careful winding. A small knot near the end of the string marked where it had once broken and been repaired. It was nearly invisible unless looked at closely. That repair made it feel older somehow. More lived in. The breeze returned, softer than before. This time, instead of lifting the kite, it simply cooled the skin. A quiet relief from the warmth of the sun. The paper fluttered once more, but gently, like a slow breath rather than a sudden gasp. Still no launch. And that felt right. There was no impatience in the air. No urgency in the posture. The afternoon seemed content with this stillness, with the simple act of holding. The kite's frame pressed lightly into the fingers again, reminding its holder of its quiet readiness. It was balanced. Waiting. The horizon shimmered faintly in the distance. Heat rose slowly from the earth, bending the light into soft waves. Standing there, the weight of the kite felt less like an object and more like a promise, not of excitement or speed, but of something gradual. Something unhurried. Another breeze moved across the field, slightly stronger this time. The tail lifted. The paper pulled. The string tightened just enough to straighten between hand and sky. But again, it was only a suggestion. The hand remained steady. The kite remained grounded. For now, simply feeling its presence, its light but steady weight, was enough. The field waited. The sky waited. And the kite, held gently against the quiet afternoon, continued to rest in patient hands. The field did not rush for anyone. It had been standing there long before this afternoon, and it would remain long after the kite had flown and returned. The grass, tall in some places and short in others, moved with a rhythm that did not belong to clocks or schedules. It bent when the wind arrived and straightened when it left, never protesting, never hurrying. Standing among it felt like stepping into a quiet ocean. Each blade leaned slightly in one direction, then another, following the soft guidance of the breeze. The movement was slow enough to notice but gentle enough to almost miss if one wasn't paying attention. It was a constant, unspoken conversation between earth and air. The kite rested lower now, its bottom edge brushing against the grass tops. The paper made a faint, dry whisper as it grazed the stems. The wooden frame remained steady in hand, but the tail trailed lazily behind, occasionally catching on a taller strand before slipping free again. A stronger breeze rolled through the field. It didn't arrive suddenly. It approached like a wave, starting far away where the grass darkened slightly as it leaned, then traveling forward in a slow sweep. Watching it come felt calming, like seeing a quiet ripple cross a still pond. When it reached this part of the field, the grass bowed together. Every blade leaned at once, tilting in unison, their soft green tops pointing in the same direction. The movement was smooth and unforced, as though they had practiced this their entire lives. The kite lifted a little in response. Not fully, just enough to ease some of its weight from the hand. The string straightened slightly, humming faintly under tension, then relaxed again as the breeze faded. There was no frustration in the moment. The field seemed to suggest that everything could take its time. The sun had shifted just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to deepen the shadows beneath each blade of grass. Tiny patches of shade appeared where stems overlapped, creating small cool places close to the ground. Kneeling down brought the world even slower. From that lower view, the grass seemed taller, more endless. The sound of wind moving through it became softer, closer to the ear, a hushed brushing, like fabric sliding gently across fabric. The kite lay partially across the grass now, its surface catching sunlight while its edges rested in shadow. A grasshopper leaped nearby, landing without much sound, then staying perfectly still as if unsure whether to move again. The breeze returned, lighter this time. Instead of bending everything at once, it brushed only the tips of the grass. The upper edges swayed, while the lower stems remained upright. It was a layered motion, top and bottom moving at different speeds. The field seemed alive, but in the quietest way possible. The kind of life that hums beneath notice. Fingers reached down absent-mindedly, letting the grass slide between them. It felt cool near the roots, warmer toward the top where sunlight touched it. Some blades were smooth. Others had rough edges that tickled lightly against the skin. Time stretched further. The afternoon's warmth settled deeper into the earth. The distant sounds of cows and birds faded into something barely distinct. Part of the background, part of the stillness. The kite's tail shifted again, lifted slightly by another passing breeze. It fluttered softly, tapping once against the grass before settling. The grass bent once more, slowly, without hurry. It did not snap back quickly. It did not resist. It simply leaned and then, when the wind moved on, rose again in its own quiet time. Watching this became more interesting than launching the kite. The bending. The rising. The endless repetition. There was comfort in that predictability. The field was never in a rush. It did not compete with the sky or argue with the breeze. It accepted movement as it came and returned to stillness when it passed. The kite remained grounded. The spool rested loosely in hand. And for a while, there was nothing to do but watch the grass bow gently again, a soft green sea moving without urgency under a wide, patient sky. There comes a moment in every quiet afternoon when stillness begins to lean toward action. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply arrives as a feeling, small but noticeable, that perhaps now is the time. The breeze had been brushing the field in soft waves for several minutes. Not strong, not steady, but present. The grass bent again and again, never in a hurry, but often enough to suggest possibility. The kite was lifted carefully from where it rested against the stems. Its paper surface caught the light, glowing faintly as the sun passed through it. The wooden frame felt steady between fingers. The spool was adjusted in the other hand, thumb resting lightly against its edge. There was no countdown. No dramatic preparation. Just a quiet shift of weight from one foot to the other. The kite was held upright, facing into the direction where the wind seemed to come from, though the wind itself had been indecisive all afternoon. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the breeze arrived. It moved first through the far end of the field, pressing the grass forward in a gentle ripple. The movement traveled steadily closer, visible in the way the tops of the blades leaned together like a quiet bow. When it reached the kite, the paper tightened. The tail lifted. The string straightened. And for the first time that afternoon, the kite pulled upward with intention. It wasn't a strong pull, more of a suggestion. But it was enough. The hand loosened slightly. A small length of string slipped free from the spool, unwinding with a soft wooden murmur. The kite rose a foot from the ground, wobbling uncertainly but determined to try. The heart seemed to pause along with it. For a brief moment, it felt possible. The kite tilted left. Then right. Its paper fluttered in uneven rhythms as the breeze struggled to stay consistent. The tail danced behind it, twisting gently in the air. Another step backward helped. The string tightened further, humming faintly with tension. The kite climbed a little higher, perhaps 2 feet now, hovering above the grass. The field seemed to hold its breath. The breeze held steady just long enough to lift the kite higher still. Its frame steadied. Its shape became clearer against the sky. It was almost flying. Almost. Then the wind hesitated. It did not disappear suddenly. It simply softened, as if reconsidering its effort. The pressure on the string lessened. The hum faded. The kite wobbled again. Its nose dipped forward slightly. The tail lost its rhythm. The paper, which had been stretched tight, began to ripple loosely. A gentle tug on the string tried to correct it. But without the wind's support, there was little to work with. The kite tilted too far to one side, hesitated in midair as if thinking about its options, and then slowly drifted downward. Not crashing. Not collapsing. Just descending with quiet resignation. It touched the grass lightly, brushing the tops before settling completely. The tail landed last, curling softly against the stems. Silence returned. The spool stopped turning. The string slackened. There was no frustration in the moment. Only a quiet acknowledgement that the afternoon was still deciding. The breeze moved across the field again, but weaker this time. The grass bent politely, then rose once more. The sky above remained wide and pale, unchanged by the small attempt below. The kite lay still. It had almost worked. Almost. Fingers gently gathered the string back in, winding it slowly around the spool. The wooden circle turned in patient rotations, the thread layering neatly over itself once more. The kite was lifted again, brushed lightly to remove a few clinging blades of grass. Its paper was uncreased. Its frame unbroken. It had not failed, it had simply tried. The field seemed unconcerned. Attempts were just part of the rhythm. Another breeze might come. Or it might not. There was no urgency. The first attempt had risen and fallen like everything else that afternoon, slowly, quietly, without drama. And standing there with the kite resting once more in steady hands, it felt clear that trying again would happen, but only when the wind felt ready. The field did not seem disappointed by the failed attempt. It simply returned to its quiet rhythm. The kite rested lightly against one leg now, its tail trailing in the grass as if it, too, needed a moment to think. The spool hung loose in one hand, the string swaying slightly with each small shift of posture. Then, without warning, though not abruptly, a breeze arrived again. It was not strong. It did not rush in dramatically. It slipped across the field like a visitor unsure how long it planned to stay. The grass responded first, bending together in a low, whispering wave. The sound it made was soft and papery, like pages turning slowly in a distant book. The air felt cooler against the skin for just a second longer than before. The kite lifted its head slightly. The paper tightened. The tail stirred, brushing away from the grass as if stretching after a nap. There was no immediate reaction. No sudden lift of arms. Instead, there was watching. The breeze moved through the field and seemed ready to continue on its way. But then it lingered. Just enough to make things interesting. The kite was raised again, slowly this time, as though not wanting to disturb the delicate balance of air. The string was held a little firmer, not pulling, simply waiting to see what would happen. The breeze strengthened for a heartbeat. The paper pulled upward. The string straightened. The tail danced in a small, hopeful circle. For a brief, quiet second, it felt steady, like the wind might hold its place this time. The kite rose a foot from the ground, hovering uncertainly. But the breeze was already changing. It softened without warning. The pressure on the string faded like a sigh. The kite tilted forward, nose dipping gently toward the earth. The tail slowed its movement, fluttering once more before settling. The kite lowered again, not falling, just returning. The breeze continued past, brushing the far end of the field before disappearing entirely. And the field returned to stillness. There was something almost playful about it, this coming and going. As if the wind were testing the patience of everything beneath it. The grass stood upright once more, each blade finding its own quiet balance. Insects resumed their faint humming. The sun held steady above, unconcerned with the small negotiations below. Another breeze came. Even lighter than before. It barely bent the grass this time, touching only the highest tips. It cooled the air slightly, lifted a corner of the kite's paper, and then slipped away again. It was impossible to predict. The wind did not follow patterns. It did not promise consistency. It arrived, brushed past, and left whenever it pleased. The kite waded through it all. Held gently in both hands now, its frame steady, its paper patient. The spool rested against the palm, thumb idly pressing into its smooth surface. Minutes passed this way. Breeze. Stillness. Breeze again. Stillness again. Each arrival brought a small flicker of possibility. Each departure left behind a soft acceptance. The afternoon seemed to enjoy this rhythm, this quiet uncertainty. It felt less like frustration and more like practice in waiting. A slightly stronger gust swept through suddenly, enough to make the grass bow deeper than before. It carried the scent of distant earth and something faintly sweet, perhaps from unseen flowers. The kite lifted instinctively, reacting before thought had fully formed. The string tightened sharply this time, humming louder than it had all afternoon. The tail whipped briefly in the air. For a moment, a real moment, it felt like the breeze might stay. But just as quickly as it had grown stronger, it thinned again. The air lightened. The pull softened. The kite settled back once more. The breeze that comes and goes had come again. And gone again. The field remained unbothered by this pattern. The sky did not change its expression. The kite remained whole, patient, ready. There was comfort in knowing that another breeze would arrive eventually. Not because it was scheduled. Not because it was promised. But because that was simply what breezes do. They come. They go. And in between, the afternoon stretches on, wide, warm, and perfectly unhurried. After the breeze had come and gone for what felt like the 10th quiet time, there was a gentle understanding that standing might not help. The field was in no hurry. The sky was not offering explanations. And the wind, wherever it wandered off to, clearly had its own plans. So instead of watching the horizon for signs of movement, there was a slow decision, almost subconscious, to sit down. The grass welcomed the shift. It bent under the weight without complaint, creating a small hollow in the middle of the wide field. The earth beneath felt firm but warm, holding the heat of the afternoon like a hidden ember. The kite was placed carefully beside folded knees. Its paper reflected a pale shimmer of sunlight. The tail lay across the grass in a lazy curve, its fabric barely stirring now that the air had stilled again. The spool rested in the lap, the strings slack and quiet. Sitting changed everything. The world felt lower. The horizon stretched higher. The sky seemed larger from this angle, filling most of the view with soft blue and thin, drifting clouds. There was nothing to do but wait. The grass brushed lightly against sleeves and fingertips. It tickled in small, unexpected ways. A few ants moved with determined purpose near the edge of the flattened patch, navigating around shoes as though they had urgent errands to attend. The field hummed faintly. Not loudly, just a steady undercurrent of life. Insects, distant animals, the faint whisper of air brushing over land far away. The wind did not come. At least, not yet. But sitting made that feel acceptable. One hand reached absently for a blade of grass, twisting it gently between fingers before letting it fall again. The spool was turned once or twice, winding and unwinding a small stretch of string, not with intention, just for the comfort of the motion. The sun had shifted again, though it was hard to say exactly when. The warmth now rested more on one side than the other, creating a soft imbalance of heat and shade across shoulders. A cloud passed slowly overhead. Its shadow moved across the field like a quiet curtain being drawn. For a moment, everything dimmed slightly. The grass lost a bit of its brightness. The kite's colors softened. Then the cloud drifted on. Light returned. Still no wind. There was something calming about surrendering to that fact. Instead of preparing for the next attempt, instead of scanning for movement, there was simply sitting. Breathing in. Breathing out. The air smelled faintly of sun-warmed earth. Somewhere far off, a cow lowed lazily, its voice stretched thin by distance. Time slowed further. The hands relaxed completely now. The kite lay flat beside its owner, no longer lifted in anticipation. The spool tipped slightly in the lap, its circular edge pressing gently into fabric. Waiting did not feel like wasted time. It felt like part of the afternoon's design. The breeze, when it finally returned, would not be rushed by impatience. It would arrive on its own quiet terms. A small beetle crawled across the kite's paper, exploring the smooth surface with slow determination. Its tiny legs made no sound, but its movement was visible against the pale background. After a moment, it reached the edge and disappeared into the grass again. The sky seemed endless. The clouds moved so slowly that it was difficult to tell they were moving at all. Their shapes shifted gradually, stretching and thinning without drama. Eyes drifted upward. The body felt heavier in the grass, as if gravity had increased slightly. The warmth of the sun, the softness of the air, the steady quiet, it all pressed gently against awareness, inviting stillness. There was no sign of wind yet. But that was fine. The afternoon was wide enough to hold as much waiting as necessary. And so there, in the middle of the open field, beside an unflown kite and a spool of patient string, sitting became the most important thing to do. The wind would come. Eventually. Until then, the grass whispered softly, the sky drifted quietly, and the world rested in perfect, unhurried calm. By now, it was clear that the clouds were making far more progress than the kite. Sitting in the grass, with the kite resting quietly at one side, it became easier to notice how steadily the sky was changing. At first glance, the blue overhead had seemed still, a wide, unbroken canvas. But the longer one watched, the more movement appeared. The clouds were drifting. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But consistently. Thin wisps stretched and reshaped themselves as they traveled. A small puff that had once looked like a rounded hill slowly lengthened into something softer, more like a feather pulled thin across the sky. Another cloud, faint and scattered, gathered slightly before dissolving into something almost invisible. Meanwhile, the kite had not moved at all. Its paper lay flat, edges brushing the grass. The tail rested in a gentle curve, no longer fluttering, no longer hopeful. The spool sat loosely in hand, string slack and quiet. The wind had grown shy again. Or perhaps distracted. A cloud passed slowly across the sun, dimming the field just enough to be noticeable. The warmth softened. Shadows deepened slightly. The grass shifted in color from bright green to a cooler shade. For a moment, everything felt hushed. Even the faint hum of insects seemed to quiet as the light changed. The cloud continued its slow journey, and sunlight returned gradually, warming the shoulders again. The field brightened, almost sighing in relief. Above, the clouds kept moving. It was subtle, but undeniable. They were traveling farther in a few minutes than the kite had all afternoon. Eyes followed one particular cloud, thin at the edges, thicker in the center. It drifted across the sky without hesitation, carried by a current too high to feel on the ground. There was no wobbling in its path, no uncertainty. It simply moved. The kite remained still. Its frame cast faint, delicate shadows across the paper. A tiny crease near one corner caught the light differently, revealing where it had once been folded long ago. But it did not lift. It did not tug. The contrast was almost amusing in its quiet way. The sky was in motion. The ground was patient. The kite was somewhere in between. A faint breeze brushed across the top of the field again, just enough to ripple the grass slightly. But it did not reach strongly enough to stir the kite. The movement stayed low, skimming the earth, leaving the air above undisturbed. Another cloud passed by, larger this time. Its shadow traveled slowly across the field, like a giant, soft hand sweeping over the grass. The temperature shifted slightly as it moved overhead. The air felt momentarily cooler. Watching the shadow travel was almost more interesting than flying the kite would have been. The way it darkened one patch of grass while brightening another. The way it slid steadily forward without pause. It felt predictable, calm. Up there, the wind was clearly stronger. The clouds proved it. They moved with purpose, gliding from one side of the horizon to the other, reshaping themselves in quiet, endless transformation. Down here, the air hesitated. It came in faint whispers, then disappeared again. The kite waited patiently for its turn to join the movement above. But there was no frustration in the waiting. Instead, there was observation. The sky was telling its own slow story, one written in shifting shapes and drifting light. The clouds continued their journey, crossing paths, thinning out, merging gently before separating again. Time seemed easier to measure by their movement than by anything else. Minutes passed. The kite remained grounded. The clouds traveled farther still. Eventually, one long, narrow cloud reached the edge of the visible sky and faded into distance. Another took its place from the opposite side, entering the frame as quietly as the last had left. The field beneath remained wide and still. The grass bent occasionally. The spool rested quietly in hand. And above it all, the clouds moved more than the kite ever had. Drifting across the endless blue while the afternoon below remained perfectly content to stay exactly where it was. It happened quietly. There was no dramatic knot, no sudden twist pulled tight by a strong wind. In fact, there was barely any wind at all. The string had been resting loosely across the lap, the spool tipped slightly to one side, when fingers began turning it absent-mindedly. One slow rotation. Then another. The motion was soothing, circular, repetitive, easy. But somewhere between winding and unwinding, the string crossed over itself in a way that did not immediately seem important. The kite remained flat in the grass. The clouds continued their steady travel overhead. The afternoon stretched on. Only when the spool was lifted again did the resistance become noticeable. A faint tug. Not from the sky. From the string itself. The spool refused to turn smoothly. It hesitated, stopped, then jerked slightly forward. The thread had looped around its own path, forming a small, stubborn crossing near the center. It was not a large tangle. But it was enough. The string that had once unwound freely now resisted. There was something strangely fitting about it. The afternoon had not been rushing toward flight, and now even the string seemed to suggest a pause. The spool was set gently on the grass. The kite lay beside it, patient and quiet. Both hands reached for the thin line, lifting it carefully so it would not tighten further. The string felt different when examined closely. It was rougher than it looked from a distance. Fine fibers brushed against fingertips, catching lightly against skin. In the sunlight, the thread appeared slightly uneven in thickness, tiny variations that had gone unnoticed before. The knot was small. Just 2 loops crossed over one another, pulled snug by earlier turns of the spool. It could have been yanked apart quickly. But that would have felt wrong. Instead, fingers worked slowly, easing one loop free from beneath the other. The movement required attention. The world narrowed to the thin line stretched between hands. The field continued its quiet hum in the background. Grass shifted softly. Insects droned faintly. A distant cowbell chimed once. But all focus rested on the string. The knot tightened briefly as one loop resisted. A slight tug in the wrong direction made it firmer. The thread pressed into fingertips, leaving faint impressions. There was no frustration. Only concentration. The afternoon seemed to approve of this slower task, something small and careful, perfectly suited to its unhurried mood. The string was lifted higher into the sunlight for better visibility. The pale fibers glowed faintly against the blue sky behind them. Each twist became clearer now, the path the thread had taken around itself, the small crossing point that needed undoing. One loop slipped free. The tension eased slightly. The knot loosened just enough to breathe. Another careful movement followed. Fingertips traced the path backward, reversing the small mistake made minutes ago without even noticing. Finally, the crossing unraveled. The string fell straight again between both hands. Smooth. Uninterrupted. The spool turned once more, gently this time, and the thread unwound without resistance. The soft wooden murmur returned, steady and calm. It was such a small thing. A minor interruption. Yet somehow it had felt important. The kite remained grounded, as though unconcerned by the delay. Its paper fluttered once as a faint breeze brushed across the field, but not enough to lift it. The string was wound back carefully now, layer by layer, each rotation neat and deliberate. There was something satisfying about the order of it, the even circles building upon one another without crossing. The afternoon light had shifted again, though subtly. Shadows stretched slightly longer. The clouds continued their steady drift overhead. And the string, once tangled by its own quiet turning, now rested peacefully in its place, straight, untwisted, ready again for whenever the wind decided it might stay long enough to matter. For now, though, there was no rush. The knot had been undone. The field remained wide and patient. And the day continued to move forward, as gently as the thread slipping through careful hands. The afternoon had reached that comfortable point where silence no longer felt noticeable. It simply existed. The kite lay beside the grass, the string now neatly wound, the earlier tangle forgotten. The sky remained pale and open. A thin cloud stretched lazily overhead, moving with far more determination than anything happening on the ground. It was then that the conversation began. Not about the kite. Not about the wind. Not even about the sky. Just about nothing in particular. It started with a small observation, something simple, like how the grass looked slightly darker closer to the earth. The kind of comment that does not demand a response but invites one anyway. Yes, came the quiet reply, after a pause long enough to feel natural. It probably stays cooler down there. The words drifted into the air and settled like everything else. There was no urgency to continue. Another stretch of silence followed, soft and easy. The spool was turned once in the lap, not because it needed to be, but because the movement felt comforting. A distant bird crossed the sky, small and barely noticeable. "Do you think the wind gets tired?" came the next thought, spoken gently, almost as if unsure whether it deserved to be heard. The question lingered for a moment. "I don't think it gets tired," the answer came slowly. "I think it just moves somewhere else." That seemed reasonable. The breeze brushed lightly against shoulders just then, as if proving the point, and then drifted on again without committing to anything more. The conversation paused. It wasn't awkward. It didn't need to be filled. Words here did not rush forward. They waited their turn, like the kite waiting for a steady current. Another comment surfaced, light and casual. "The clouds seem faster today." "They always seem faster when you're watching them." A small nod followed. There was something oddly comforting about speaking without direction. No big ideas. No plans. No conclusions to reach. Just small thoughts floating up like the clouds above, appearing, shifting, dissolving. The grass rustled faintly. A blade tickled against an ankle. "Do you remember when the kite got stuck in the tree last year?" A soft exhale of amusement answered first. "Yes. It stayed there for weeks. Longer than that. Maybe." The memory wasn't heavy. It didn't demand detail. It simply passed through the air like the breeze, there for a moment, then gone again. The kite beside them did not move. The string remained loose. The sky remained patient. "Maybe it doesn't matter if it flies today," one voice said quietly. "It doesn't." That settled the matter. The conversation drifted further. To how the earth smelled warmer in the afternoon, to how cows always seemed to move slower after lunch, to how clouds sometimes looked like things but never stayed that way long enough to be certain. Nothing in particular. And yet, it felt full. Each sentence carried the softness of the day within it. There was space between words, generous space, where the field filled in the silence with its steady hum. A faint breeze returned again, brushing across the tops of the grass. The kite's tail lifted briefly, tapping once against the paper before falling still again. "Almost," someone murmured. "Almost." No one moved to lift it this time. The afternoon felt too comfortable for effort. The conversation continued in this gentle rhythm, short thoughts, slow replies, occasional laughter that barely rose above the quiet field. The sun edged slightly lower without announcing itself. Shadows grew longer, stretching thin across the grass. Eventually, the words grew fewer. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because there didn't need to be. The field spoke enough on its own. The clouds continued their quiet travel. The kite waited patiently. And the conversation about nothing in particular faded naturally back into the wide, peaceful silence of the afternoon. By now, the afternoon had grown deeper. Not darker, just fuller. The light felt thicker somehow, more golden than before, stretching gently across the field. The shadows of the grass were longer, thin lines leaning toward the east. The kite still rested beside the grass, its paper calm, its tail motionless. And then, from far beyond the edge of the visible field, came the sound. A low, steady call. A cow. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo dramatically. It simply drifted through the air, carried on a thin ribbon of wind, and settled softly over everything like a quiet reminder that life continued beyond this one patch of earth. The sound lingered for a moment before fading. Then another answered. A little farther away. A little softer. The voices did not overlap much. They were spaced apart. Slow and unhurried, as though the cows themselves had no need to rush their conversation either. Sitting there, listening, it became clear how far away they must be. The sound reached the field thinner than it began, stretched by distance. It felt almost like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. The grass stirred faintly. The breeze, though light, seemed just strong enough to carry the calls across the open land. Another lowing reached the ears, longer this time. A gentle, drawn-out tone that faded gradually rather than stopping suddenly. It blended with the hum of insects and the soft brushing of grass until it became part of the afternoon's quiet music. The kite did not react. The spool remained in hand, unmoving. The sky overhead continued its slow drift of clouds, indifferent to the voices below. There was something comforting about the cows being there, even unseen. They gave the field depth. They gave the silence texture. Without them, the open space might have felt endless. With them, it felt lived in, shared. A faint metallic clink followed one of the calls, perhaps a bell around a neck, tapping gently as its wearer shifted weight or lowered its head to graze. The rhythm was irregular. Call. Pause. Soft bell. Long pause. Call again. The pattern was soothing in its unpredictability. The afternoon seemed to lean into it. The sound did not demand attention, yet it was impossible not to listen for it once it had been noticed. Another breeze slipped through the grass, cooler now than earlier in the day. It brushed lightly against the kite's tail, lifting it just enough to stir the fabric before letting it fall again. The cows called again. This time almost overlapping, as if one had answered before the other had finished. The sound carried longer, perhaps because the wind held steady for a few seconds more than usual. It felt distant but close enough to matter. Sitting in the field, it was easy to imagine them beyond the low rise in the land, heads lowered, chewing slowly, tails flicking lazily at flies. Their world likely moved at the same pace as this one, slow, steady, unhurried. The spool was turned once, gently. The string remained slack. The kite remained grounded. But the field no longer felt entirely still. The distant cows had given it a voice. Not loud. Not constant. Just enough. Another call rose and fell in the distance. Then silence again. The sky shifted slightly as a cloud moved past the sun, dimming the grass for a brief moment before light returned. The afternoon carried on. The cows continued their slow, unseen conversation somewhere far beyond the horizon. And here, in the middle of the open field, beside a kite that still had not flown, listening became the most natural thing in the world, to the wind, to the grass, and to the gentle, faraway sound of distant cows drifting across the quiet land. At some point, sitting no longer felt necessary. The afternoon had softened enough that even posture seemed optional. So, without ceremony, there was a slow lean backward. Elbows lowering first, then shoulders, and finally the back resting fully against the warm earth. The grass cushioned the fall gently, bending beneath the weight and springing back slightly around it. The kite remained beside the outstretched arm, its paper faintly rustling as it shifted against the stems. From this angle, the field disappeared. The horizon slipped out of view. There was only sky. Wide. Open. Endless. The blue stretched farther than thought could follow. Thin clouds drifted across it, delicate and slow, their edges dissolving and reforming as they traveled. They seemed closer now, larger, as though lying flat had brought them nearer. The sun hovered just outside direct sight, bright enough to warm the skin but not so sharp as to demand closed eyes. Light filtered through blades of grass leaning overhead, creating soft green shadows that swayed gently across the face. The world felt upside down in a pleasant way. Instead of standing beneath the sky, it felt like floating within it. A cloud shaped vaguely like a long ribbon passed overhead. Its center was thicker, wider, while the edges frayed like threads pulled loose. Watching it required no effort. It moved on its own, steady and patient. The kite, from this low position, appeared taller than before. Its frame stood upright in the grass where it had been propped absent-mindedly. Against the sky, its paper looked almost translucent. Sunlight filtered through it, revealing faint lines of the wooden support beneath. But it did not lift. It only leaned slightly with each faint whisper of breeze. The grass tickled gently at the ears. An insect buzzed briefly overhead, crossing from one side of the sky to the other before vanishing beyond sight. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Lying flat made time feel even slower. Clouds seemed to stretch longer. The space between their movements widened. Breathing became deeper without effort, the rise and fall of the chest matching the slow rhythm of drifting shapes above. Another cloud followed, thicker this time, casting a faint shadow as it crossed the sun. The light dimmed just enough to cool the skin slightly, then warmed again as the cloud moved on. The spool rested loosely against the side, string coiled neatly. The earlier tangles, the almost flight, the waiting, all of it felt distant now. None of it seemed urgent. From this angle, it was hard to imagine standing up again anytime soon. The sky filled everything. The blue seemed to grow richer as the afternoon leaned toward evening. The edges of clouds caught hints of pale gold, subtle and soft. A faint breeze finally reached this low position, brushing across cheeks and stirring a few loose strands of grass overhead. It lifted the kite's tail gently, enough to make it flutter once, then twice. But still, no full lift. That was fine. Watching the sky felt like enough. The clouds continued their quiet journey, moving farther in these few minutes than the kite had all day. They never hesitated. They never doubled back. They simply drifted on. A distant cow called again, barely audible from this angle, its sound blending into the vastness above. Eyes followed a small, wispy cloud until it thinned into almost nothing. Then another took its place. The afternoon seemed content to stretch on this way forever, the earth warm beneath, the sky open above, and everything in between moving at the slowest, most peaceful pace imaginable. The kite stood patiently nearby. The wind lingered somewhere unseen. And lying flat in the grass, watching the sky drift endlessly overhead, felt like the most important thing to do in the whole wide field. It happened so gently that at first it was difficult to be sure. Lying flat in the grass, eyes following the slow travel of clouds, there was a subtle change in the air. Not stronger exactly, just steadier. The breeze no longer arrived in quick, uncertain visits. It lingered. The grass responded first. Instead of bending in short, uneven waves, it leaned in a more unified direction. The tops of the blades tilted together and held that tilt for a few seconds longer than before. The air felt cooler across the face. The kite's tail lifted. Not in a quick flutter, but in a smooth, continuous rise. From the ground, the shift was obvious now. The paper tightened where it had been slack. The wooden frame straightened, as if finding its posture. There was no sudden scramble to stand. Only a slow roll to one side, pushing up carefully from the grass. The spool was reached for without hurry. The string, coiled neatly, felt ready beneath the fingers. The breeze held steady. That was new. The kite was lifted into it again, facing the direction of the wind, which, for the first time all afternoon, felt certain about where it was going. The paper pulled upward immediately. The string tightened with a clean, humming sound, clearer than before. The tail streamed out behind in a soft line instead of twisting aimlessly. A step backward. Another. The spool began to turn, unwinding with a smooth wooden murmur. The string slid free in even layers, no resistance, no tangles. The kite rose. Not wobbling this time. Not tilting left and right in confusion. It climbed slowly but with purpose, its shape growing smaller against the sky. The tail fluttered in a steady rhythm, no longer frantic, no longer uncertain. The field seemed to lift with it. Grass leaned deeper, brushing in long, flowing motions. The breeze moved confidently now, no longer shy, no longer distracted. The kite reached higher, 10 feet, then 20. The string hummed gently between fingers, vibrating with the constant pull. It wasn't a harsh tension. It was balanced, a quiet agreement between wind and hand. Another length of string slipped free. The spool turned easily, the wood warm against the palm. Each rotation felt smooth, natural, inevitable. The kite steadied itself fully now. It no longer looked like it might fall. It had found the current above, the stronger air that had been moving the clouds all afternoon. It tilted slightly into the wind, holding its position without struggle. For a moment, everything else seemed smaller. The earlier waiting. The tangled string. The almost attempts. All of it faded beneath the simple fact that the kite was finally flying. Not dramatically. Not wildly. Just steadily. The sky behind it remained wide and pale. A thin cloud drifted past, and for a second, the kite crossed in front of it, its silhouette sharp and clear against the softer white. The string stretched long now, a faint line connecting earth to sky. It shimmered slightly where sunlight caught it. The breeze continued, not strong enough to pull uncontrollably, not weak enough to fade. Perfect. The grass bent and swayed in calm rhythm. The distant cows called again, their voices carried more clearly on this steadier air. The kite rose a little higher still. Then held. It did not need to climb endlessly. It simply needed to stay. And it did. The spool slowed as the desired height was reached. Fingers tightened slightly around it, anchoring the line. The tension felt alive, a constant, gentle tug that reminded the hand that something above was moving. The tail streamed behind the kite in a long, soft arc. No frantic flutter. No falling. Just flight. The afternoon had shifted. The sky seemed deeper now, more golden at the edges. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting warmer light across the field. And up there, finally, the kite moved with the same steady confidence as the clouds that had been drifting all day. It had caught the air. And this time, the air decided to stay. Once the kite found its place in the sky, everything else became quieter. Not silent, just softer. The field still hummed. The cows still called now and then. The grass continued its slow bending beneath the steady breeze. But all of it felt like background to the thin, living line stretched between hand and sky. The string was no longer slack. It was alive. There was a gentle, constant pull against the fingers, not enough to hurt, not enough to demand effort, just enough to remind them that something was happening above. The spool rested firmly in one hand now, thumb braced against its rim. The other hand lightly guided the string, feeling its fine fibers press against the skin. The thread vibrated faintly with each shift of wind, sending small tremors down to the fingertips. It felt almost like holding onto a quiet heartbeat. The kite itself was higher than before, steady against the pale blue. Its shape was small now, no longer detailed enough to see every crease, but clear enough to know it was balanced. The tail trailed behind it in a soft, flowing line. The breeze did not rush. It moved consistently, not strong, not weak, just steady enough to keep the kite aloft without strain. The pull on the fingers deepened slightly when the wind strengthened, then softened when it eased. Each change was subtle, like the rise and fall of breathing. There was no need to look at the kite constantly. The string told the story. When the line tightened, the wind was stronger above. When it hummed faintly, the current was smooth. When it slackened just slightly, the breeze had dipped. The connection felt simple and complete. Earth below. Sky above. A thin line between. The sun lowered a fraction more, warming the side of the face. Shadows across the grass stretched longer and thinner, reaching toward the far edge of the field. A slightly stronger gust arrived without warning. The string pulled firmer now, pressing into the fingers with more insistence. The spool turned a fraction before being steadied. The kite tilted upward slightly, rising a few more feet. The pull was not alarming. It was firm but controlled. Hands adjusted instinctively, loosening just a bit to let the kite settle back into its rhythm. The line steadied again. The gentle tug returned. The grass swayed more deeply for a few moments, then returned to its usual rhythm. The cow's distant calls seemed clearer on this steady air, drifting across the open land without interruption. Standing there, feeling the small movements through the string, time seemed to move differently. Minutes passed unnoticed. The world narrowed to the simple sensation of contact, that thin thread pressing lightly against skin. The fingers began to understand the wind without seeing it. A faint tremor meant the breeze had shifted direction slightly. A smooth, even tension meant the current was strong and straight. It was a quiet language, spoken through pressure and vibration. The kite dipped once, barely, and the pole softened for half a second. A gentle lift of the spool corrected it, not pulling hard, just guiding. The tension returned to its balanced state. The connection felt secure. There was no fear of losing it. No worry of the string breaking. It felt as though the wind and the hands had come to an agreement. The sun slid lower still, painting the field in warmer gold. The sky deepened slightly in color, the blue turning richer near the edges. The kite held its place. The string remained taut. And the gentle pull on the fingers continued, steady, reassuring, alive. It was not dramatic flight. It was not high or wild. It was simply a quiet conversation between wind and hand, carried through a single, humming line. And in that steady pull, there was something deeply calming, as if the sky itself were breathing slowly, and the fingers were holding on to its rhythm. The sun had begun its quiet descent, though no one had announced it. It simply lowered itself gently, as if careful not to disturb the afternoon. Across the open field, shadows stretched and thinned, reaching farther than they had before. The tall grass cast long, narrow shapes that overlapped and folded into one another like soft brushstrokes on the earth. The kite still hovered above, steady and patient. Its string remained lightly taut, the gentle pull on the fingers unchanged. But the light around it had shifted. What had once been bright and white was now warm and golden. The air itself seemed thicker with stillness. Even the breeze moved more thoughtfully now, slower, less eager. The grass bent without hurry, and when it rose again, it did so as though it had all the time in the world. The cows in the distance had grown quieter. Their calls were fewer, softer, spaced farther apart. The field no longer felt wide and busy, it felt long and calm. Shadows crept slowly toward the feet. At first, they only brushed the toes, thin lines of darkness crossing the shoes. But minute by minute, they grew, deepening in tone and stretching farther across the ground. There was something comforting about watching shadows grow. They did not rush. They did not demand attention. They simply lengthened, quietly marking the slow passage of time. The kite shifted slightly as the wind thinned. The pull on the fingers softened, not disappearing, just becoming gentler. The spool rested easily in the palm, no longer needing firm grip. The string hummed faintly, though even that sound seemed lower, softer. Above, the sky had begun to change. The bright blue had faded into a gentler shade. A hint of pale amber appeared near the horizon, blending slowly into the upper sky. A few clouds, once bright white, now held soft edges of gold. The kite drifted through this warmer light, its tail tracing faint arcs against the sky. Standing there, watching the shadows stretch and blend together, the field felt larger and smaller at the same time. Larger, because the light revealed more of its depth. Smaller, because the quiet gathered everything into one shared moment. The breeze paused. Just for a breath. The string slackened slightly, and the kite dipped a little, lowering without complaint. There was no urgency in its movement. It simply responded to the absence of wind the way grass responds, by yielding. Then, slowly, the breeze returned. Not strong, not insistent, just enough. The string tightened again, and the gentle pull came back, familiar and calm. The shadow of the kite could now be seen faintly on the field below, a small, flickering shape moving over the grass. It danced unevenly, distorted by the folds and hills of the earth. The long shadow of the one holding the string stretched across the ground as well, tall and elongated, nearly touching the path that led back home. It looked almost like another person standing beside them, silent and patient. The field no longer felt like afternoon. It felt like the quiet space between afternoon and evening, that slow pause when the world exhales. A bird passed overhead, its wings cutting softly through the sky. Its shadow skimmed across the grass for only a moment before disappearing into the lengthening dusk. The temperature shifted subtly. Not colder yet, just less warm. The sun lowered another fraction, brushing the tops of distant trees with a soft amber glow. The kite remained steady, though lower now than before. It seemed content with the height it had found. The string still connected sky to hand. The pull was lighter, but still there. Shadows grew longer. Silence grew deeper. And in that widening quiet, the field held everything gently, the fading light, the drifting kite, the steady breath of wind, as if it understood that this moment did not need to be hurried. It only needed to be felt. And so the afternoon stretched into silence, one long shadow at a time. The wind shifted without warning. Not strongly, not violently, but just enough to change the feeling in the string. The gentle pull that had been steady for so long flickered. For a moment, it felt uncertain, like a sentence that had not yet decided how it would end. The kite tilted. Not dramatically. Just slightly to one side. The spool turned a little faster in the hand, and the string tightened more than before. The fingers reacted instinctively, adjusting their grip, steadying the roll, feeling the new tension. The breeze strengthened for a few seconds, pressing forward across the field. The grass bent deeper, whispering in long waves. The shadows trembled as the blades shifted under the new pressure of air. Above, the kite climbed suddenly, higher than it had been all afternoon. The string pulled firmly now, pressing against the skin with a seriousness that had not been there before. It was not painful. But it was strong. The spool turned more quickly, the wood warm against the palm. The tail of the kite fluttered sharply, no longer drifting but snapping lightly in the air. For one brief second, a thought appeared. What if it slips? The image formed quickly, the spool tumbling from the hand, the string unwinding too fast, the kite rising higher and higher without control. The thread growing thinner, weaker, until the wind pushed harder again. The line vibrated sharply. The fingers tightened. The heart beat just a little faster. But the grip held. The spool steadied. The kite wavered once, then found a new angle against the wind. The field seemed to pause, watching. The grass remained bent under the stronger breeze. The long shadows flickered like quiet witnesses. The worry did not grow. It hovered only briefly, like a small cloud passing across the sun. The hands adjusted carefully, letting out a small length of string, not fighting the wind, just allowing it space. The tension eased slightly. The kite stopped climbing. It held its position. The pull on the fingers softened from firm to manageable. The breeze began to calm. Not suddenly, just gradually, like a wave returning to the sea. The grass rose slowly from its deeper bend. The tail of the kite stopped snapping and returned to its gentle flow. The string's vibration smoothed into a steady hum. The moment of worry faded. In its place was something quieter, relief, perhaps, but softer than that. Understanding. The kite was not fragile. The wind was not cruel. They were simply moving together, adjusting as needed. The spool rested comfortably in the palm again. The fingers loosened slightly, though they did not let go. Above, the kite seemed smaller against the deepening sky, but steadier somehow, as if it too had settled after the brief test. The sun was lower now, casting warmer tones across the field. The amber light brushed the edges of the clouds, painting them with faint gold. A final lingering gust passed through, much softer than before. The string tugged lightly, almost playfully, and then returned to its calm rhythm. The earlier fear felt distant now, small and unnecessary. The line had not snapped. The kite had not escaped. It remained where it belonged, connected. There was something comforting in that realization. Things can sway. They can pull. They can strain. But they do not always break. The field returned fully to its quiet. The cows in the distance shifted slowly, their shapes darkening against the lowering light. A bird crossed the sky once more, unhurried. The fingers still felt the gentle pull. Not strong. Not weak. Just present. And with that steady tension came calm again, deeper this time, as if the brief worry had only made the stillness feel more certain. The kite floated peacefully. The wind breathed softly. And the moment passed, leaving only the quiet reassurance that sometimes, even when the pull feels uncertain, the string still holds. The wind did not rush anymore. It moved in long, patient breaths across the field, rising and falling like something that had learned not to hurry. The kite floated steadily against the deepening sky, its shape small but certain. The brief worry from earlier had passed completely, leaving behind a calm awareness, a sense that the connection between hand and sky was strong enough. The spool rested easily in the palm. And slowly, almost without thinking, a new rhythm began. Let a little string out. Pause. Feel the pull. Let a little more. The motion was gentle and deliberate. The thumb loosened just enough to allow the spool to turn, releasing a small length of thread. The string slipped forward with a soft whispering sound, barely audible over the breeze. The pull deepened slightly as the kite rose higher. Then it steadied. Pause. Feel. The line vibrated faintly, sending small pulses through the fingertips. It was like listening with the hands instead of the ears. Another small release. The spool turned again, smooth and careful. The string slid between fingers in a controlled glide, not too fast, never rushed. The kite climbed gradually, not in leaps, but in slow, graceful lifts. With each measured release, the connection changed subtly. The tension shifted. The angle of the string tilted higher toward the sky. The tail of the kite traced wider arcs as it found smoother air above. There was a comfort in the pattern. Let out. Pause. Feel. Adjust. It became almost like breathing. Inhale, the wind strengthens, the string tightens. Exhale, the spool turns, a little more sky is given. The field seemed to understand this rhythm too. The grass bent in long, slow waves, following the wind's pace. The shadows stretched even farther now, thin and elongated across the golden ground. The sun hovered low, softening everything it touched. The kite was higher than it had ever been that afternoon. Still not distant enough to disappear, but high enough that its movements felt smoother, less interrupted by shifting currents near the ground. The string hummed quietly. Not a sharp vibration, more like a steady, gentle note. The fingers felt it clearly now, that continuous, living thread of tension. Not tight. Not slack. Balanced. Another small release. The spool turned in a patient circle. The line slipped out in a clean arc, catching the light for just a moment before blending into the sky. The kite rose another few feet. Then it steadied again. The rhythm continued. There was no need to look at the spool anymore. The hands seemed to know when to loosen, when to hold. It was no longer a task. It was simply movement flowing from one moment into the next. The breeze cooled slightly as the sun dipped lower. The air carried a faint evening scent. Earth and grass settling after a long day of warmth. The kite leaned gently into a stronger current above, and the pull increased just enough to be noticed. Pause. Feel. Hold steady. The tension evened out again. The spool rested. Then, slowly, another release. Each small letting go brought a quiet sense of trust. Trust in the wind. Trust in the string. Trust in the steady grip of the hands. The sky had deepened into softer tones now. Pale gold near the horizon, light blue above fading slowly toward evening. A thin cloud drifted lazily past the kite, not touching it, just sharing the same space. The rhythm did not stop. It slowed, perhaps, but it continued. Let out. Pause. Feel. The line grew longer, but the connection did not feel weaker. If anything, it felt more secure, as though the distance had strengthened the understanding between earth and sky. The kite floated calmly, high and steady. The spool rested lightly in warm fingers. The field breathed. And the quiet rhythm of letting string out continued, not as an action to be completed, but as a gentle pattern that seemed to belong to the afternoon itself. The field had grown quieter still. The wind no longer moved in long, confident breaths. Instead, it drifted gently, like a final sigh at the end of a long day. The kite remained high, steady in its place, the string stretched in a pale line toward the softening sky. The spool rested loosely now. There was no more need to let out string. The height felt right. The balance felt certain. So the hands relaxed. And in that relaxation, attention shifted downward. The shoes were lightly covered in dust. Not thick, not heavy, just a fine layer gathered from walking the narrow path and standing in the dry grass. The dust clung to the edges of the soles and brushed faintly against the sides. A small scuff across the toe caught the sunlight. The warmth of the sun lingered gently on the tops of the shoes, warming the fabric. It was the kind of warmth that did not burn or press, just rested there comfortably. The grass around them had flattened slightly where feet had stood for so long. A quiet imprint marked the place, not deep, just enough to show that someone had been there, holding onto a string that led upward. The sunlight turned golden now. It wrapped itself around everything, the grass tips, the distant fence posts, the edges of the trees far beyond the field. Even the dust seemed to glow faintly. The air held a warm stillness, as though the day was reluctant to move forward into evening. A faint breeze brushed past again, carrying the soft scent of earth. The string lifted slightly in response, the gentle pull returning to the fingers for a moment before settling once more. But attention stayed below. A small line of dirt marked the hem of the trousers, gathered from brushing against tall grass. It was not messy, just evidence of time spent outside. A step shifted slightly, pressing the sole deeper into the dry ground. A faint crunch. Tiny pebbles underfoot. The dust lifted in a barely visible cloud before settling again. The field floor felt steady and real, solid beneath everything happening above. The warmth of the sunlight pressed gently against the shoulders and the back of the neck. It was the kind of warmth that made movement feel slower, heavier in the best way. Not tired. Just unhurried. The kite drifted slightly to one side, but the hands adjusted without thinking, guiding it back into place. The motion was automatic now, subtle and smooth. The dust on the shoes remained still. The grass whispered softly. A few insects hummed low among the blades, their quiet sound blending into the background. The sun dipped a little lower, brushing the tops of the shoes with a deeper amber tone. Shadows stretched farther across the ground, long and thin. The dust caught the light in small flecks, like tiny specks of gold. There was something grounding about noticing it. About feeling the earth directly beneath the feet. The sky held the kite. The hand held the string. But the shoes held the ground. A quiet balance existed between the three. The warmth of the sun began to soften, no longer pressing but simply lingering. The air cooled just slightly, enough to notice if paying close attention. The breeze touched the dust again, lifting a few grains from the surface of the path and carrying them only inches before letting them fall. The field felt content. Nothing demanded change. Nothing asked to be hurried. The shoes remained planted. The dust remained warm. The kite floated above. And in that simple awareness, of sunlight on fabric, of earth beneath soles, of warmth settling gently across the field, there was a deep and quiet comfort. The day had not ended yet. But it was resting. And so were the feet, steady in the dust, under the last gentle warmth of afternoon. The light had changed again. It was no longer bright gold, nor pale afternoon blue. It had softened into something quieter, a muted blend of amber and fading warmth that seemed to settle gently over the entire field. The afternoon was growing sleepy. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just slowly, the way eyelids lower when no one is watching. The kite still floated high above, but even it seemed calmer now. Its movements were smaller, more measured. The tail no longer fluttered sharply. It drifted in slow, relaxed curves. The string held a light tension, not firm, not loose. Just enough to remind the fingers that it was still there. The wind had become thoughtful. It moved in softer patterns, brushing the tops of the grass without bending them too deeply. Each gust lasted only a few seconds before fading into stillness again. The field responded by growing quieter. The insects hummed less. The distant cows had settled into near silence, their shapes darkening against the far edge of the land. Even the birds overhead seemed fewer now. The sky above held the last clear stretch of blue, but near the horizon it had begun to deepen. A faint pink hue brushed along the edges of thin clouds, barely noticeable unless one paused long enough to see it. The sun hovered low, large and calm, no longer intense. Its warmth rested lightly on the shoulders and back, but it felt gentler. Like a blanket that had cooled slightly after a long day in the sun. The shoes remained planted in the dust. The grass around them had stopped whispering and now only stirred occasionally. The spool rested easily in the palm. There was no longer a need to let out more string. There was no need to pull it in. The kite had found its place. And so had the afternoon. A small breeze passed by, just strong enough to lift the string a little higher. The pull returned briefly, pressing against the fingers in a soft reminder of connection. Then it eased again. The rhythm had slowed. Everything felt spaced out. Sounds came farther apart. Movements lasted longer. Even breathing seemed to stretch gently, deep and unhurried. The field felt like it was preparing for rest. Shadows had grown long enough to blend into one another, creating wide stretches of cool darkness between the last patches of sunlight. The path leading back home looked softer now, its edges less sharp in the dimming light. The kite's shadow on the ground had become faint, almost disappearing into the darker grass. Above, the sky deepened further. The pink along the horizon warmed slightly before fading toward a gentle orange. The blue overhead softened toward evening. The afternoon, once bright and wide, now felt small and cozy. Contained. Like a quiet room with open windows. The string still hummed faintly when the wind touched it. But even that sound seemed to slow, to stretch, to yawn. The hands holding the spool relaxed more fully now. The fingers curled around the wood without effort. The earlier focus and small adjustments had given way to stillness. There was no urgency left in the air. No expectation. No rush to finish. The kite floated lazily, almost as if it too felt drowsy in the fading light. The grass leaned gently and rose again, slower than before. The dust on the shoes cooled as the sun dipped lower. The field exhaled. And in that long, quiet exhale, the afternoon grew sleepy. Not ending. Not yet. Just drifting gently toward evening, like a kite high in the sky, held by a steady string, moving slower and softer with each passing moment. The wind did not disappear. It simply softened. As if it, too, had grown tired of carrying the kite all afternoon. The field felt different now, less open, more enclosed by the deepening colors of early evening. The sky had begun its quiet shift from warm amber to muted lavender, and the last glow of the sun hovered low along the horizon. The kite still floated above, but its movement had changed. Where it once leaned confidently into steady currents, it now drifted in smaller arcs. The tail followed gently, barely lifting, as though it no longer wished to dance, only to sway. The string felt lighter. The pull on the fingers was faint now, almost delicate. The spool rested in the palm without tension. The wood felt smooth and warm, though the air around it had cooled slightly. A soft breeze passed through, not strong enough to bend the grass deeply, only enough to ripple its tips. The string lifted a little, then settled. The wind softened again. There was a quiet in the space between each breath of air. A longer pause. A deeper stillness. The field no longer hummed with insects. Their sounds had faded into the background. Even the distant cows seemed to have withdrawn into calm shapes against the far fence. The shadows had grown wide and full, merging into one long blanket of dusk. Only small patches of fading sunlight remained, resting gently across the tops of the grass. The kite dipped slightly. Not from struggle. Just from the absence of lift. The string slackened a little, brushing softly against the fingers. The spool did not turn. There was no rush to adjust. The breeze returned for a moment, just enough to steady the kite again. Then it quieted once more. The pattern repeated. A small breath of wind. A gentle lift. A slow easing. The sky above had grown softer in tone. Pale lavender stretched upward, blending into a deepening blue. A single faint cloud drifted slowly across the open space, tinted with the last blush of sunlight. The air carried a cooler touch now. It brushed lightly against the face and hands, no longer warm, but not yet cold. Just calm. The kite hovered lower than before. Its height had decreased gradually without being noticed, each softened breeze lowering it just a little more. The string held only the lightest tension. The fingers felt almost no pull at all. And yet the connection remained. The spool sat quietly in the hand, unmoving. The grass no longer bent. It stood upright, still and quiet, like a field that had finished speaking for the day. A final gentle gust passed through. It was soft, softer than any before. The string lifted barely an inch. The kite responded with a slow, lazy sway. Then the air rested completely. For a long moment, there was no movement. No sound. No tug. The wind had softened into near stillness. The kite remained in the sky, but it felt closer now, less distant, more grounded. As if the sky itself were lowering gently toward the earth. The light dimmed another shade. The horizon glowed faintly, but the brightness of day was nearly gone. The field felt wrapped in quiet. The spool remained steady. The string lay almost weightless between fingers and sky. The wind, once playful and steady, now whispered only occasionally, soft enough to barely be heard. And in that softening, the afternoon gave way to something slower and deeper. The wind had not left. It had simply grown gentle. And everything beneath it, the kite, the grass, the hands holding the string, had grown gentle too. The sky had grown dim enough that the kite no longer stood out clearly against it. It was still visible, a small, steady shape suspended in the fading light, but its colors had softened into silhouette. The tail, once bright and lively, now blended into the deepening blue. The wind had nearly stilled. Only the faintest currents moved through the air, just enough to keep the kite from falling completely slack. The time had come. Not because anything demanded it, Not because the string had strained, but because the day itself had quietly decided. The fingers shifted around the spool. For the first time in a long while, the motion reversed. Instead of letting string out, the hands began to turn the spool inward, slowly, carefully. The wood rotated with a soft, familiar whisper. A small length of string tightened. The kite responded immediately, dipping just a little lower. There was no resistance. No sudden tug. Only a gentle change in height. Turn. Pause. Feel. The rhythm returned, but softer now, not a pattern of release, but of gathering. The spool turned again. The string wound neatly around it, each loop resting beside the last. The line grew shorter, drawing the sky closer inch by inch. The kite drifted downward in a slow arc. The breeze offered only mild assistance, barely lifting it at all. Instead of leaning into the wind, the kite now surrendered to gravity in patient steps. The grass below waited quietly. The field seemed to watch without judgment. The fingers moved steadily, not hurried. Turn. Pause. The line grew shorter. The connection remained just as alive as before, though the tension was softer, almost thoughtful. The kite wavered once, then steadied. Its descent felt peaceful, as if it understood that its time above had been long enough. The sky had deepened into twilight now, lavender fading into blue-gray. The last hint of orange along the horizon thinned into a quiet glow. The spool continued its slow turning. Each rotation brought the kite a little closer. The tail fluttered gently, brushing through the calmer air. The shoes shifted slightly in the dust, adjusting stance as the angle of the string lowered. The grass barely moved at all now, standing still in the cooling evening. Turn. Pause. The kite was no longer distant. Its shape became clearer, its edges more defined. Another careful winding. The string no longer hummed, it simply rested between fingers and spool, quiet and smooth. The descent felt like closing a book slowly, not snapping it shut, but finishing the last page with care. The kite dipped lower still, now hovering just above the field. Its shadow, faint in the dim light, brushed the grass for a brief moment before disappearing again. The hands kept turning the spool. Steady. Measured. The line shortened further. Soon, the kite was close enough to see the small creases in its fabric again, the tiny bends created by hours of wind. Another slow rotation. The tail brushed the tops of the grass. Then, gently, softly, the kite touched down. Not with a thud. Not with a collapse. Just a quiet settling, like a leaf returning to earth. The spool stopped turning. The string rested loosely now. The kite lay still among the grass, its fabric catching the last faint traces of twilight. The field was fully calm. The wind had finished for the day. The hands lowered slightly, holding the spool at rest. There was no sadness in bringing it down. No regret. Only a soft understanding that everything rises for a time, and everything returns gently when the day grows quiet. The sky above remained open and deep. The field below held the kite once more. And the string, no longer stretched tight, rested peacefully between them. The kite rested quietly in the grass, no longer lifted by wind, no longer stretched toward the sky. It lay flat now, its fabric softened by the fading light of evening. The tail stretched loosely behind it, still and untroubled. The spool remained in one hand, though the fingers had relaxed completely. The string no longer pulled or hummed. It simply rested, slack and gentle. Slowly, the other hand reached down. The grass brushed softly against the wrist as the kite was lifted from the ground. A few blades clung briefly to its surface before falling away. Up close, the paper showed the story of the afternoon. Small creases where the wind had pressed firmly. Tiny bends along the edges where it had tilted and adjusted in the air. Nothing torn. Nothing damaged. Just signs of movement. The tail was gathered first. It was drawn in carefully, looped lightly so it would not tangle. The ribbon-like strip slid easily through the fingers, smooth and cool in the evening air. The light had dimmed further now, turning everything into softer shapes. The last line of orange on the horizon had thinned into pale silver. The kite's frame felt light in the hands. A delicate structure, thin wooden sticks crossed carefully beneath the paper. The string was unwound from the final few inches, released gently from the small notch at the base. The spool was set aside in the grass for a moment. Then the folding began. Not rushed. Not careless. One edge brought inward first, aligned slowly with the center crease. The paper responded with a faint whispering sound as it bent along familiar lines. Pause. Adjust. Smooth the surface with a palm to flatten any small air pockets. The second edge folded inward next, meeting the first. The kite grew smaller in the hands. Compact. Contained. The tail was tucked neatly along the fold, hidden safely between layers. The paper felt cool now, no longer warmed by direct sunlight. It carried the faint scent of grass and open air. Another fold, this one gentler. Not pressing too hard. Just enough to keep the shape secure. The spool was picked up again. The remaining string was wound slowly around it, the final loops guided carefully into place. There was no need to hurry, the evening had already settled fully across the field. The sky above had deepened into a calm blue-gray. A single early star blinked faintly into view, small and patient. The field no longer whispered. It rested. The folded kite was held lightly against the chest for a moment, its paper edges smooth beneath steady hands. There was something satisfying about the careful folding. About returning it to stillness. The afternoon had lifted it high, carried it through currents and light. Now it was small again. Simple. Quiet. The spool was secured, the loose end of string tucked neatly beneath a final loop so it would not unravel. The kite was folded once more, just enough to make it easy to carry. The grass around the standing place had flattened slightly, but it would rise again overnight. The dust on the shoes remained as quiet evidence of time spent there. The folded kite rested under one arm now. The spool held firmly but comfortably in the other hand. The field stretched wide and darkening ahead. The air felt cooler, brushing softly against the face. Everything had slowed completely. There was no more wind to chase. No more string to release. Only the quiet satisfaction of folding paper with care, of finishing something gently, without sharp edges or hurried hands. The sky held its first few stars. The earth held the memory of the afternoon. And the kite, now folded small and safe, carried the softness of the day within its quiet layers. The first step away from the standing place felt different. Not heavy. Not reluctant. Just aware. The grass shifted softly underfoot as the walk began, brushing lightly against the sides of shoes that still carried a thin coat of dust. The flattened patch where the afternoon had been spent remained behind, already beginning to lift in the coolness of evening. The folded kite rested securely under one arm, light and still. The spool was held loosely in the other hand, no longer needed for guidance, only carried. The field stretched wide ahead, but it no longer felt endless. In the dimming light, it felt closer. More contained. The sky had deepened into a calm blue, and along the horizon the last thin ribbon of brightness had faded into gray. A few more stars appeared, faint at first, then clearer as the light drained slowly from the day. Each step made a soft sound. A faint crunch of dry earth. A whisper of grass. Nothing more. The breeze had nearly disappeared entirely. Only a slight movement of air brushed against the face now and then, cool and gentle. The cows in the distance were quiet shapes against the darkening land. Their outlines softened by dusk, they seemed almost painted into the horizon. The path back was familiar. A narrow stretch where the grass grew shorter, worn gently by many small crossings over time. It wound through the field without sharp turns, leading steadily toward the edge where trees gathered in deeper shadow. The folded kite shifted slightly under the arm with each step, its paper edges brushing softly against fabric. It felt lighter than before, not because its weight had changed, but because its purpose had been fulfilled for the day. The spool tapped lightly against the side of a leg once or twice, a quiet reminder of the hours it had spent turning and releasing. The air cooled further. It settled against the skin in a way that felt refreshing rather than cold. The warmth of the sun had fully withdrawn now, leaving behind a calm and even temperature. Halfway across the field, there was a pause. Not out of necessity. Just to look back. The place where the kite had flown was darker now, blending into the rest of the field. It was difficult to tell exactly where the afternoon had unfolded. The sky above that spot was wide and empty. No small shape floated there anymore. Only open space. It did not feel empty in a sad way. It felt complete. The walk resumed. The grass whispered faintly at ankle height. The scent of evening earth grew stronger, cool soil and settling air. A small sound carried across the field, perhaps a distant gate shifting, or the soft rustle of leaves from the trees at the far edge. It blended easily into the quiet. The steps remained slow and steady. There was no hurry to reach the other side. The day had already finished its work. The field seemed to watch calmly as the figure crossed it, folded kite in hand. The stars above grew slightly brighter. One or two more appeared. The sky darkened into a deeper shade, and the line between land and horizon became softer. Near the edge of the field, the grass thickened slightly, brushing more firmly against the shoes. The dust clung stubbornly, unwilling to fall away. The trees ahead stood in quiet silhouette, their branches barely moving. Another step. Another soft crunch. The walk felt like a gentle closing, not just of distance, but of time. The afternoon had begun with open sky and rising wind. It ended with folded paper and cooling air. And now, Crossing the field in near silence, everything felt balanced. The spool rested calmly. The kite remained tucked and safe. The field stretched behind, dark and peaceful. And the walk back continued, steady and unhurried, beneath a sky slowly filling with quiet stars. By the time the far edge of the field drew close, the air had changed completely. The warmth of the afternoon was only a memory now, a soft echo lingering somewhere in the grass. In its place, the evening air had settled in, cool and smooth, brushing gently against skin and fabric alike. Each breath felt clearer, sharper in a quiet way that only evening can be. The folded kite remained tucked securely under one arm, its paper edges cool to the touch. The spool rested loosely in the other hand, no longer warm from the sun, but comfortable all the same. The field behind had grown darker, its wide openness blending into one calm stretch of shadow. The details that had once been so vivid, individual blades of grass, dust on shoes, distant fence posts, had softened into silhouettes. The sky overhead deepened into a rich blue. Stars appeared one by one, not all at once, but patiently, small points of light scattered across the vastness. They did not shine brightly yet, they simply existed, steady and quiet. The evening air moved lightly through the trees at the edge of the field. Leaves rustled softly, not in a gust, but in a gentle stirring that felt like a whisper shared between branches. The path narrowed here. Grass gave way to firmer ground, and the crunch beneath each step changed from dry earth to packed soil. The shoes carried the field with them, dust clinging softly to the sides, grass brushing at the laces. A deeper breath filled the lungs. The air smelled different now, less of warm grass and more of cool soil and distant wood. It carried a calmness that only comes when the sun has fully stepped aside. The shoulders relaxed further. The hands holding the kite and spool no longer felt the faint tension of wind or string. Everything was still. Even the body's rhythm seemed to match the evening, slower steps, longer breaths. Behind, the field rested completely. No movement disturbed its surface. No wind traced across its length. It lay quiet beneath the darkening sky, holding the memory of the afternoon like a story already told. The coolness grew slightly stronger as the minutes passed. Not cold, just enough to notice. The warmth that had once pressed against the back of the neck was gone now, replaced by a soft chill that encouraged steady movement. The folded kite shifted lightly under the arm as the walk continued. Its paper gave off a faint rustling sound, barely audible. The spool tapped once against a leg again, a small wooden reminder of the afternoon's patient turning. The stars grew brighter. A few constellations began to take shape, though not sharply defined. They shimmered gently, unbothered by the quiet world below. The trees at the edge of the field stood tall and dark, their branches forming delicate patterns against the sky. A single leaf detached and drifted downward, landing silently on the ground. The air cooled another degree. The breath became faintly visible for a moment, not a full cloud, just the slightest hint of warmth meeting cooler air. The day had fully ended now. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just gently. The path ahead led toward home, faintly visible in the dim light. A distant window glowed softly somewhere beyond the trees, offering a quiet sign of warmth waiting inside. The field, the kite, the wind, all of it had settled into memory. And the evening air continued to cool, wrapping around everything in calm stillness. Each step forward felt natural, unhurried, balanced. The folded kite remained safe. The spool remained quiet. The sky deepened. And the evening air, cool and steady, carried the last traces of the day into a peaceful night. The door closed softly behind, and with it, the last sounds of the field faded into quiet memory. Inside, the air felt still and warm compared to the cool evening outside. Not warm from sunlight, but from walls that had held the day's heat gently within them. The folded kite was placed carefully on a small wooden table near the door. Not tossed. Not dropped. Just set down with the same care used to fold it. The spool followed, resting beside it, its string wound neatly and secure. The wood made a faint, hollow sound as it touched the table's surface, a small, final note from the afternoon. Shoes were slipped off slowly. A faint line of dust marked the floor where they had stood. Grass clung lightly to the soles before being brushed away. The body felt different now. Not tired from effort, but pleasantly heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes after time spent outside in steady air and warm light. A window stood slightly open. Through it, the night air drifted in gently, cool and calm. The scent of earth still lingered faintly, carried in on a soft breeze. Outside, the stars had grown clearer. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a single small lamp that cast a warm glow across the walls. The folded kite remained still on the table. Its paper edges looked smaller now in the quiet room than they had in the wide field. But somehow, it seemed fuller, as if it carried the entire sky within its folds. The spool's string caught a small glint of lamplight before settling back into shadow. A chair creaked softly as it was pulled back. A quiet sigh filled the room, long and content. Sitting down felt like settling into something deep and familiar. The memory of the afternoon drifted gently through the mind. The tall grass bending without hurry. The steady pull of the string against fingertips. The moment of brief worry when the wind had strengthened. The rhythm of letting the string out. The careful winding as the sky dimmed. None of it felt sharp or urgent anymore. It felt soft. Blurred at the edges. Like the feeling just before sleep when thoughts drift slowly and comfortably from one to another. The field no longer felt distant. It felt close, like a quiet place waiting patiently in the background of memory. A small breeze passed through the window again, lifting the corner of a curtain before letting it fall. The air inside cooled slightly, wrapping around the room in calm stillness. The folded kite did not move. It rested completely. The spool lay quiet. The dust from the field had settled. The body leaned back into the chair. Eyes closed slowly. The afternoon replayed in fragments, not as clear images, but as feelings. The warmth of sunlight on shoulders. The coolness of evening air. The gentle hum of string between fingers. The softness of grass underfoot. Each memory carried no weight. No urgency. Only calm. It felt less like remembering something and more like drifting into it, like stepping back into that wide open field without needing to move at all. Breathing slowed. The room grew quieter. Outside, the night settled fully across the land. The field rested beneath the stars. The grass stood still. The path waited in darkness. And the kite, folded carefully and placed by the door, held the story of the day in its quiet paper shape. The memory of the afternoon did not demand attention. It simply existed, warm and steady, like the feeling of lying down for a short rest in the middle of a peaceful day. A memory that felt like a nap. Soft. Unhurried. Complete. And with that gentle thought, everything settled into stillness, the room, the field beyond, and the quiet space between waking and sleep.